Hello and welcome back to Yupari's portrait course. I am Yupari and I am going to be your guide as we explore the realm of traditional portrait painting. And in this week's video we're going to be moving on to part 2 of 3 for this painting that I would like to call the Uplifting pose. And in this video we're going to be transferring the drawing that we constructed in the last video onto a panel, and then we're going to be constructing the underpainting just using zinc white and raw umber. And you'll see that just using pretty much monochrome, we're going to be able to create the illusion of form in a very simplistic manner. So let's get to the video. Here is the transfer drawing that we created last time. And if you want to see exactly how this transfer drawing was created, I'm going to have a link in the description below to that video. So now we're going to take this transfer drawing, which was done in graphite, and we're going to transfer it. So now we're going to use just some tracing paper and a burnt umber colored pastel pencil, and we're going to trace out very carefully the outline. We don't have to lose any bit of information in terms of the contours or even the understanding of the structure when we're transferring. So here we're going to very carefully capture the linear structure as carefully as possible. And again, if you want to know exactly how that transfer drawing was constructed, there's going to be a link in the description below to that video. So after we've outlined the linear structure, we're going to flip the transfer paper over and we're going to shade over it with some medium to soft vine charcoal and cover it completely. Again, this is the back side of the transfer paper. After that's all said and done, we're going to take the transfer paper, flip it over, and trace over it with a ballpoint pen. This is just a simple blue pen. You could use any color you'd like, but I just chose blue. And what this is doing, it's pushing the charcoal beneath the backside of this paper onto the surface that we are going to be painting on, thus completing the transfer. So let's flip over the transfer paper, and there you have it. The drawing is now transferred and we're ready to get started. So one optional thing that you can do is go over it with oil paint or acrylic paint, but lately I've actually been going over my transfer drawing with the pastel pencil. And again, if you're ever curious as to what materials I'm using, all of that information will be typed up in the description box for you. And again, this is optional. You don't have to trace over it. Now let's just double check and make sure that those lines aren't going to fall off when we switch to oil painting. And you can tell that the lines are not falling off when we're pressing on it with a dry brush. This is just a simple dry brush just to test and make sure that the lines don't fall off. And now we're ready to go. On the palette, you can observe we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 values pre-mixed on our palette from lightest to darkest using zinc white and raw umber. And the reason I chose zinc white over lead white, which is my preferred white, is that zinc white is just a lot cheaper and it is still a transparent white. I would have loved to use my lead white for this, but that's just too much paint. And when the sitting is done, so when this underpainting is done, all of that paint will be put into a container and put in a freezer so that I can reuse it whenever I want to. And again, we're going to be taking the values directly, as you can observe, we're taking the values directly from those pre-mixed tones. So we're not really going to be doing any mixing. And when we're going between values, I'm actually cleaning off the brush by, you can't see it with the camera angle, but I just rubbed the paint off of it using paper towel. And so we're working with planes. We're going to be constructing a fully monochromatic underpainting. And the reason we're constructing this underpainting in this way is to facilitate the colors. And so the colors that we will build on top of this, in my opinion, will be better informed with a tonal underpainting. And the reason I'm using raw umber is because raw umber and white creates a very nice middle gray that gives you a compressed value range that you can build on top of. Now then, with the planes, you can clearly tell that we have established a light facing plane. So this plane right here is close to being perpendicular to the light source, and as the planes turn further away from being perpendicular to the light source, they turn into shadow. So the planes that are in the shadow side of the portrait are planes that are parallel to the light source, or they are just being covered by a cast shadow. So now you can clearly tell we're just sculpting away at these planes very three-dimensionally. So right here, this plane, we're observing that that plane is not as perpendicular to the light as the plane that we painted lighter. But again, we're going to still build those planes. And so the goal of the underpainting, again, is to facilitate the color pass, but at the same time, we're going to be adhering to the fat over lean principle when it comes to layering oil paint. So that refers to the amount of oil that you use. And so in the beginning, when you're layering a painting, you want to use less oil. And so the oil I'm referring to is the medium that you choose to use, or the mineral spirits. The medium that we're using is Neo-Megilp. And again, all of that's going to be typed in the description box for you. But that is just to thin out the paint. The Neo-Megilp is also a fast dryer, but I'm using very little of it. And when I use it, all I do is just dip the brush into the Neo-Megilp, and that's it. But I'm using very little of it. As you can tell, I'm just taking right from those pre-mixed values on my palette. Very much dry brushing it. And raw umber is also a very fast dryer. So if you want to work on this maybe the next day, you can possibly work on it the next day. So here we are sculpting away at the planes. So now you can see a very clean gradation of values going from light to dark, and very quickly, actually, because we don't have to worry too much about mixing the values on our palette. We have them right there readily available to us. And so you can very easily tell now how each value is indicating a plane, and a plane in relation to the light source. Now this plane right here, you can't really tell because it's very close to the tone of the canvas, or sorry, the tone of the panel. That panel, by the way, is toned with neutral gray acrylic mixed with a little bit of burnt umber and some white gesso. And again, the color doesn't matter. It's just a neutral gray tone that I chose for the tone of the panel. So now you can see another gradation as we approach the glabella. And the glabella is going to be kind of like the intersection of the forehead and the plane change for the nasal bone. Or you can think of it as the space in between the eyes. You can also think of that too. So now we're adding a lighter plane here because we noticed that this plane actually needs to be facing the light a little bit more. So each individual value is describing the angle of the plane in relation to the light source. Not so much the distance, but the angle that the plane is making in relation to the light source. Again, the model's head is not the size of a skyscraper, so the gradation of values based on the distance of the light source will not change that much. But what will change is the tone of the value based on the angle that the shape is making. So now we're starting off with the concavity of the eye socket, and we're going to be creating this underpainting piece by piece, and that is so that we spend all of our time focusing on each individual shape as opposed to moving all over the place. You can work that way too, but I find that this is a little more adherent to creating a more volumetric painting, because you're analyzing where each plane change is occurring one step at a time. So now we're going to be moving up the value scale. So now we're getting a little bit lighter as we approach the eyebrow, but darker as we approach the concavity of the eye. And that's some three-dimensional thinking for you, because it's kind of hard to see on the photo reference, but in nature we know that we're angling away from the light as we approach the concavity of the eye socket, because it turns into the little manifold that creates the upper eyelid. And now, of course, this is a superficial form. This is the eyebrow. So the eyebrow, the dark of the eyebrow, is pretty much just almost like a shadow tone, maybe a little bit darker, but nevertheless, we're going to put that value in there. Just because it's a superficial form doesn't mean that we don't pay it respect. And so now we're going to be building the planes that are angling away from the concavity of the eye. And you can tell that the thinking is very three-dimensional in the language that I'm speaking to you, because we're referring to angles in relation to the light. Not so much thinking about flat shape anymore. We're thinking spatially. We're thinking of these angles. Now there's going to be a dark accent right here. And again, this is going to be another superficial value. And that is because the model has very thick eyelashes, which create a very dark tone above her eyes. Almost looks like makeup, but I assure you it's her eyelashes. And so this dark shape, again, is not the darkest I can go, but it's perhaps one value lighter. And again, you saw that I had that value scale mixed up. So I'm, again, taking from those pre-mixed values from my palette, which also makes this stage of the process much faster than if we had to mix them on our own. And now we're actually working our way from the dark of the eye, and we're also creating the structure of the light side of the tear duct. So this is a plane that's turning now, angling away from the light and turning into shadow. The closer and closer it gets to the shadow, the darker and darker it gets. And we're very easily describing these gradations of value by taking right from that pre-mixed palette of values that we have. And another thing I should mention is that I'm pretty much using the same brush with all of this, so this kind of is easier on the brushes if you're concerned with that. And so now we're going to be sculpting this plane right here, and that plane that we just put in is angled a little bit further from the light than, say, the forehead, but it's still in light, so we're going to have to describe that as closely as possible. Remember, in the beginning, we tried to figure out where things fit. Then we want to describe how things are interacting with the light. So that's what we're doing now. And then after this underpainting is done, we will then start to describe the flesh tones. But for now, we're just focusing solely on the angle of each plane in relation to the light. So now even the sclera of the eye is going to be rendered. So the sclera of the eye, also known as the white of the eye, as you know, is not white. In fact, it's a pretty neutral color. It's still local value in general is much brighter than, say, the skin tones, but nevertheless, it's not straight white. And you can almost think of it as a white sphere, a whitish sphere. So we're going to render it just like we would a sphere. Now, the sphere is very soft and the value changes are very subtle. And so we're going to make those value changes very subtle with the gradations of tone that we place. Notice how I'm kind of interlocking each layer of paint with one another on the white of the eye just to create a very subtle gradation of tone. And this is also a very relaxing process because you're taking the portrait one step at a time. So again, this dark here is perhaps the third from the darkest, and we're going to use it for the iris of the eye. So remember, the iris of the eye is not black, even though the photograph may make it look black. I assure you that it's not. And so we're going to let this show. And remember, in the transfer drawing, if you saw the video on the transfer drawing, we tried to describe the dark lights. You can clearly see how that's kind of transferring over with the underpainting, that idea of describing the form through the dark lights. And so now we're placing in the dark shape for the dark of the eye as it turns into the upper eyelid. We're thinking very three-dimensionally with that shape there. And now pretty much with the second to the lightest light, we put in a little shape there for the highlight of the eye. Now we're going to come back in and place a little bit of light right here for the lightmost facing area of the sclera. Again, even the sclera of the eye is being considered in terms of its position in relation to the light source. Now it's getting a little bit more neutral as it approaches the bottom. And already you can tell that the painting is starting to look very dimensional, very three-dimensional in a very short amount of time. And remember, it's not about the time, but rather it's about the attention and focus that we place on observing the model. Remember, spend as much time observing as you do painting, and really try to hone in on your observation skills. And so now this little area right here is getting darker, that accent, as the form of the side of the eye socket starts to turn into the eyelid shape itself. And now we have a little tone right here for the bottom of the lower eyelid. Now this is going to create the lower eyelid. Remember, the eyelids are pretty much there to protect the eye. So that is, they mimic the curvature of the eye. So the lower eyelid is also going to be a little bit more on the round side. So the value gradations are going to be very subtle. And now we have a darker plane just beneath the bottom of the lower eyelid, and that plane is going to be intersecting with the corner of the side of the eye socket, and so it's going to create a kind of pathway between the two forms. And so here is how we connect one form with another form very simply. We're going to observe how the value gradation and the edge gradation changes from one shape to another. So this shape right here is actually a little bit darker, and now we have connected those two forms, creating the volume of the side of the eye socket. And now here's the little light plane for the little ridge surrounding the tear duct. And so this little light value here is going to describe the angle, again, in relation to the light source. And so here we have a very simple gradation of tone here. Notice how simple it is to make that soft edge. Now again, the edge quality of each form is going to be really important. So the nostril is going to be the darkest dark, the concavity of the nostril on the nose. And so this edge is actually going to be pretty sharp. So we're going to be starting off with this darkest dark. And we're going to be, again, taking it one step at a time, one feature at a time. And that's also why I'm splitting up these videos into different parts, so that I can give you more footage and explain with a little bit more clarity the process involved in creating these paintings. And so we started off with the darkest dark. But this dark that we place for the nostril is not straight black, because the darkest we can go is raw umber. So again, it does compress the value range, which will give us more options in terms of our tonal range when we switch to the color pass. So now we're starting to gradate away from the darkest dark, and this is probably 2 steps above the darkest dark on our value scale. It's pretty dark, but still light enough for you to notice the gradation of tone. And very rapidly, we're going to start to see the volume emerge from these tiny little value changes. And so here we have the cast shadow of the nose. So there are 2 shadows that we're trying to describe here. The cast shadow and the form shadow. So the form shadow is the shadow directly on the form of the nose, and the cast shadow is the shadow being casted from the nose onto the face. And so the cast shadow in general, at least with this pose, is a little bit darker than the form shadow. So the cast shadow here is perhaps 1 step above the darkest dark. So it's 1 step above the dark of the nostrils. And again, the edge of the cast shadow is actually going to be a little bit softer because the photo reference is taken from natural light. So in natural light, these cast shadows aren't as sharp. So now you can see that we're softening the cast shadow, and this little softening or this little division between the shadows also sometimes referred to as the penumbra. But in any case, all we did was just soften that corner, and now we have the cast shadow of the side of the wing of the nose, and this is the shadow being casted from the wing of the nose to the right. And now you can see why we're choosing to work in monochrome, because these value gradations would be kind of difficult to obtain if we were working in color. Now again, working in color, there's nothing wrong with working in color right away, because I mean, I've certainly done that so many times. It would be kind of a contradiction for me to tell you not to do that. Again, I encourage you to try every different method that you possibly can. But I will say that working in monochrome makes it much simpler to observe exactly what the forms are doing in space than jumping right in with color. And so here we have a dark accent, and that is the form shadow actually from the bulb of the nose. So now here we're describing the form shadow on the wing of the nostril to the left of your screen, and we're able to very carefully and very precisely depict the boundary of the shadow because of that transfer drawing that we created. Remember that transfer drawing, we didn't transfer too many lines from the transfer drawing, but the lines that we did transfer are giving us all the information that we need to develop the forms. So now we have a dark light turning right into the form shadow of the nose. Remember, the dark light is the most important light because it's the light just as light starts to turn into shadow. And now we're going to strengthen that shadow shape. And the shadows are kind of the final 3 values on my value scale. Remember, the value scale on the palette is pretty much just 11 values pre-mixed together, but the final 3 are pretty much the ones that are being used for the values on the shadow. So now we're starting to paint in the form shadow for the wing of the nose, and this form shadow is probably the 3rd to the darkest of the values on the value scale. And I will emphasize that pre-mixing of tones on the palette has actually helped me tremendously. I just one day decided to do that, and it really did help me. So I hope that will in terms help you as well. And so now we're building our way into the light. So that value we painted is precisely the dark light, and now we're going to be painting in the light light. And now you can tell that we're starting to have some sense now of the 3-dimensionality of the wing of the nose. as we start to describe these tones. Now this shape here is angling further away from the light, but not quite in shadow. Now this area right here is actually going to be a very peculiar area because I can't tell if it's dark light or if it's form shadow. But we can paint it as we observe it. It is a plane that's darker than the surrounding planes, but not as dark as the nostril. So we'll leave it as that. Now we have the bulb of the nose. So the bulb of the nose in particular is mostly round. Not always the case. In some models it's much more rectangular. But with this model, as you can see on the image, the bulb of the nose is fairly round. And so, again, just like the sclera of the eye, just like the white of the eye, the curvature is going to be described through very simple gradations of tone. Notice how we're building our way up to the lightest light. And on a little side note, this panel that I'm using is, I really like this panel. I've used other panels, not to get too off topic, but this panel that I'm working on is very helpful in terms of layering these paints because the paint just sticks right onto it. And again, all of the information in terms of the materials I'm using will be given to you in the description box below. Now, in any case, we have painted in the top plane of the bulb of the nose, thus completing the curvature of the bulb of the nose. We could, of course, go in and make the transition softer, but now we're going to paint in the highlight of the nose, and that is going to complete the volume of the nose itself. Now we're going to move on to the side plane of the face shortly. So now we're going to start to paint in the side plane of the face, and so this is going to be the darkest area right here. So we're starting off with the dark light, and so I'm actually starting off with the fourth to the darkest tone. Remember, I have 11 tones, 11 values on my palette, so I'm starting off with a dark light, just like I did with the transfer drawing. Remember, the transfer drawing was to observe not only where the shapes fit in relation to one another, but at the end we did place in the indications of the dark light. And remember, in the transfer drawing I said that the stronger the transfer drawing, the stronger the painting. And so, again, here we are testing out that idea. And so we know exactly where the dark light is going to fit because we already found that in the transfer drawing. And now it's just a matter of relating the angles of the planes to one another as the form turns into the shadow. Now, anatomically, what we're doing is we're constructing the forms that are overlapping the cheekbone. The forms that are overlapping the zygomatic bone, which is a fancy way of saying the cheekbone. And there are also muscles on the face, the zygomaticus major and minor, and I won't go into detail about that, but those are going to be muscles around the side of the face that are going to be pretty much strands of muscles in the same direction as the tones that we're starting to put onto the side plane of the face. But not to overcomplicate things, we're just observing the planes as they are interacting with the light source. Now this plane here is a little bit lighter as we approach the top plane of the cheekbone. So now this light here is perhaps maybe 4 lights actually beneath the lightest light, but it's still lighter than the surrounding planes. And so now here we're going to add in pretty much the 5th light below the lightest light for the top plane. And now here we have an angle here that's turning away from the light, but still not quite as dark as the dark light. Now we actually took a little bit of the dark light value just to soften the transition between the top plane of the cheekbone and where it intersects with the bottom of the lower eyelid. And now we have this plane here that's pretty much just one step lighter than the plane to the right of it. And now this plane right here is an intersecting plane, so it is going to be the conjunction between the side plane of the nose and the cheek. And this degree of specificity is very I would say it's easier to obtain this level of specificity when working with a monochromatic underpainting with a transfer drawing. It makes the process that much more simple. Now we're just going to soften that transition between the two because we are thinking about edge quality a little bit. So the edge of that intersection of forms just a little softer, and now we're painting in this lighter plane for the face. Now we probably made it a little too light, which is okay. We're just going to come back in with the darker plane right here, and pretty much just like a chisel, just carving away at it and making it closer and closer to the volume of the form that we're looking at. So here we are, just trying to edit this plane right here and angle it further to the light. Again, we're working with a very specific goal in mind here, which is to describe the way that these planes are angling in relation to the light, and we're focusing on the edge quality between the forms. Now we're going to move on to the mouth. So we're going to start off with the mouth, and this is one area of paint where I did apply a little bit of the medium. So this is using a little bit of the Neo-Megilp medium. And again, the medium is just to thin out the paint. Rather than using odorless minerals to thin out the paint, I would recommend trying to obtain some type of medium to use to do that. And so now we're moving up the value scale. So we started off with the darkest dark for the accents of the side of the mouth, and now we're going to be painting in pretty much one step above the darkest dark, and then we're going to work our way up. Now we're another step, so we're 2 steps above the darkest dark. And again, I cannot stress enough how useful it is to have these values already mixed and ready for you, because you know exactly where you are in terms of the value scale. So now this is actually 3 steps now above the darkest dark. And then you can picture how we're going to keep moving up the value scale to create the curvature of the lips. Now remember, maybe if you've seen my previous videos, I talk about fast curves and slow curves. So the curvature of the bulb of the nose I would describe as a fast curve because the values were changing quite rapidly as the form was turning quite quickly. And the cheek area was a slow curve. The values on the cheek are much slower. And now the values on the lip here are actually kind of in the middle. They're not really too much of fast curves or slow curves. They're kind of in the middle. Remember, a fast curve has very rapid value gradations, such as the bulb or even the wing of the nostril. A slow curve has very subtle gradations, like the values on the cheek of the face. So now you can tell we're just trying to carve at these tones, making it darker as it angles away from the light, lighter as it angles closer to the light. So now this area right here for the light area of the upper lip is going to be lighter, and the edge between this light plane and the middle plane of the lip is actually going to be a little bit sharper. So rather than generically making it a almost like a vaporous soft balloon-like shape, we're actually going to be letting some of the plane change show, because the lips aren't like balloons. They do have certain plane changes between the top plane and the bottom plane. And so now moving on to the bottom lip, we're going to be starting off with this lighter light, and again re-ensuring that the subtlety and the grace of the linear structure of the lower lip is not lost. So we're going to make sure to establish that boundary between the upper lip and the lower lip. still trying to maintain this beautiful curvature. You can notice how the line is gracefully moving up, curving down, becoming flat, and then curving down again. And so now just a little darker right here on the side of the lip. And we're going to put in the shadow. This is a cast shadow being casted from the bottom of the lip. But again, we're working in natural light, so the cast shadow is not going to be as sharp. Remember, natural light or north light tends to be a little bit of a softer light than, say, using an electric light. Now here we have the side plane of the lip. Now we're going to be moving our way across. Now here we have a little bit of a bottom plane. We're keeping the values very close together, but we will introduce some value and planar shifts as we go. This edge is a little bit softer, so we created that edge with a value, an intermittent value. And again, remember the forms have edges too, so we want to think about those edges as well. And so now we're painting in the gradation as this corner of the side of the lower lip gets darker because, as you know, it's angling away from the light source. And now we're going to just make this edge actually a little bit, we're going to angle the edge a little bit to the right and paint in a little bit more of this cast shadow. In general, with the underpainting, you really want to keep the shapes as soft as you can. I mean, not overly soft, but you do want to keep a softer touch than you would if you were working on the final color pass. Now we're going to go and paint in the top plane of the lower lip. So this value is the third from the lightest value. Remember, on the 11 value scale. And I didn't choose 11 values because of any particular reason. I just tried to mix up as many value shifts as I could using my raw umber and zinc white. And it just so happened that I made 11. So anyway, let's soften this edge now. Remember, we want to keep these edges as soft as we can possibly have them, yet not overly soft. And I just used a dry, cheap watercolor brush to soften those edges. And so now we're going to work the planes surrounding the mouth. So to be specific, we're going to be working on the orbicularis oris. Now, if the name confuses you, don't worry. It's just the form surrounding the mouth. And what these forms do is encapsulate the mouth and describe the curvature of the planes surrounding the mouth. So as you know, the value that we place has a specific angle. So the plane has a specific angle in relation to the light, which is giving us the values, as I've said already. Now, the angle surrounding the side of the orbicularis oris is in general a little bit further away from the light. If your light source is, of course, above the model, that would change if you have the light source below. But in any case, here we are starting to paint in this dark light. So we're starting off with the dark light first, and we're making these edges very soft. Now, this is a cast shadow beneath the lower lip, but it just so happens that we are working under the influence of natural light, so that is daylight. And so those edges being casted from the shadows are going to be much softer. Now we're moving a little bit above, so we're getting closer to the top of the lip. And this area of the orbicularis oris is going to be facing the light a little bit more, but not that much. So that's the key, knowing exactly where you are on the value scale. Now here we are painting in the side plane of the corner of the chin. So as the orbicularis oris starts to turn into the face, we then overlap with the bone, creating the chin. Now, I'm not an anatomist, so if I say anything wrong anatomically, forgive me for that. I'm describing you how these values are interacting with these shapes. So now we see that the uh, dark light is being painted in with the fourth to the darkest tone. Remember, the shadow is going to be consisting of the bottom three values. So now we're using that fourth to the darkest value for the side of the mouth as it turns into the structure of the orbicularis oris, and we're going to soften it with the brush, but we kind of just like obliterated the corner of one side of the mouth, but that's okay. We can paint that back in very easily. If you found it once, you can find it again. So now let's paint in the dark right about here. So the dark to the bottom of the lip as we work our way further to the bottom area of the orbicularis oris, and all of the values surrounding the mouth consists of the structure of the orbicularis oris, or should I say the bottom of the orbicularis oris. So you can very cleanly tell that we're modeling the form based on the particular boundaries of the structures. And so now we're delineating the bottom of the orbicularis oris, and this angle change right here is also going to give us the shape of the chin. And so the chin is actually going to be receiving a little bit more light. So working up the value scale, we're going to create the top plane of the chin. But now you're starting to get a sense of the dimension, the three-dimensionality of the structures here. And you can tell the paint is kind of thick. We're not really using that much medium. We're not using that much oil. We're not using that much mineral spirits. Pretty much just dry brushing this on. And it's much easier to paint like this when you have your values already predetermined for you. And so now we're just working that gradation of tone. The chin is kind of a slow curve. It's not as slow of a curve as the cheek or the forehead, but it is a fairly slow curve, say in relation to the curvature of the lips. So now we have a little bit of a subtle edge between these forms. So let's just try and make these edges as subtle as we can possibly make them. And so now this plane right here to the bottom of the orbicularis oris is going to be a little bit darker, but of course it'll get lighter as it approaches the plane of the chin. And now the side right here, this little gesture I made, is the form boundary of the orbicularis oris, and so the shapes surrounding it are actually going to be facing the light a little bit more than the edge of the orbicularis oris. That is, this shape that I'm painting in right now is the area on the face. Just as we move away from the orbicularis oris, you can picture it as a wave almost, because it gets darker the closer that we get to the shadow, lighter the closer do we get to where we're painting, and then darker again as we approach the side of the orbicularis oris. And now, of course, we're going to be softening those transitions with the watercolor brush. And lastly, we're going to paint this little triangle here, which indicates the angle of the plane just as we turn into the shadow, which of course you know is the dark light. So now we're pretty much using the third from the darkest tone, so we are kind of tampering into the shadow tone a little bit, but then moving up the value scale again to create a kind of middle. So this is kind of in the middle between the third to the darkest value and the fourth to the darkest value, almost kind of extending the value scale really. But in any case, all we're doing is just making this transition to the shadow a little bit darker and a little bit more smooth. So now you can really tell the full volume surrounding the structure of the mouth. And let's just soften it just a little bit more. Now remember, the entire value scale in the lights is ranging from here to here. All of this is the light, and all of this is the shadow. You can see how the shadows, or the tones in the shadows, are compressed. And you can also see how this value scale that we mixed up is helping us out. And remember, when this sitting is done, all of these paints will be put into a plastic container and put into my freezer so that I can use it again whenever I'm going to be working on another underpainting. Alright, so now we're filling in the value for the shadow side of the face. Now this part of the painting is fairly mundane. It's just filling in this shape of tone and describing a little bit the connection between the shadow shape and the dark light. Now that edge is very crisp and cleanly delineated for you, but we will soften it. Now we're softening it. So softening the transition between the shadow and the dark light, and that is almost a magical transition, really, between the light and the shadow. That dark light, I would describe it as almost the magical value. If I were to put the words magical and values together, I would say that the magic really does occur when you properly describe the transition between the light and the dark. So here we're going to have a close-up of how to do that. So we're now at the fourth to the darkest value on the palette, and very softly starting to turn the forms into the shadow, yet still trying to maintain the delineation between the two. So now we moved one value up again, and again that combination of values on the palette is just making this that much more simple. So now here we're moving onto the bottom portion of this area. Now again, moving up the value scale, we're going to start to build. See, that was a little too light, so we're going to move one down. And now here we're going to start to create that transition. Still a little bit too light. So again, I'm just going to put a darker tone now and create these transitions. And again, this is the magical area. This is the magic value that creates the illusion of the form. So we're just softening the corners here because we have a little too much paint. And the way that we clean that brush, I should say the softening brush, is just by rubbing it on a dry cloth just to clean it. In any case, now we're going to be adding yet another value to describe the rate of this turn. So again, kind of like a pencil, really creating these hatch marks following the direction of the form and the way that we're applying these marks. Just like we did with the transfer drawing, very accurately trying to describe the way that the dark lights are turning into the shadow. So now we added another gradation of tone. Again, all of these tones that we're adding is just to soften this edge between the light and the shadow. So here we are with the softening brush, just making it a little bit softer. And it doesn't take that much, really. Just a very light touch to get this delineation to work. And now you can see the magic is kind of starting to happen between the light plane of the face and the shadow. More or less, that's how we're creating this transition between the two. And let's just soften this little area right about here. And you really want an absorbent surface to work on when you're doing something like this. So I find that this panel is actually very nice for this type of work. Now we're going to be pretty much just filling in the dark shape of the hair with the darkest value. And now after we fill that in, we're going to work the edge between the dark shape of the hair and the form shadow of the side of the face. These transitions, these edges, should I say, should be kept as soft as you can, yet still trying to maintain the delineation between the hair and the face. But in general, the hairline surrounding the shadow should be a little bit softer than the hairline surrounding the light of the forehead. Now we're going to paint in the light of the drapery, creating a very crisp edge here. This edge will be the sharpest edge in the painting. Again, we're focusing on the edge quality with the underpainting as much as we can. So this edge is going to be much sharper. And the way you can create a sharp edge, not only through physically putting more pressure on the paint, but also the contrast between the light and the dark shapes also helps to create the illusion of a sharper edge as well. So this edge right here is very nice and crisp. And now we're going to very quickly move on to the light on the side of the clothing that the model is wearing. So just a little light touch right here, just to kind of scumble the paint onto this area. And again, we're making the edge a little bit almost ghost-like. Now we're going to move on to the values within the clothing. Now in the transfer drawing, I didn't draw in the shadow shapes for the clothing that the model was wearing, simply because I thought I would be able to figure it out with the paint, and hopefully I can. So it's not very complicated. These shapes are very simple and very abstract. And if anything is going to go wrong in the portrait, I would rather it be the clothing than the face, to be honest. So that's why I didn't really spend too much energy on the clothing that the model is wearing. So in any case, this shape right here, notice how we're moving down in the value scale. This area right here is a form shadow. So this is the form shadow on the clothing that the model is wearing. Now the drapery is, the local value is much brighter, and thus the form shadow is also going to be much brighter. So the form shadow on the clothing that the model is wearing is pretty much similar to the halftones on the model's face. And this is a relation that probably would have been a little bit more difficult to figure out if we were jumping right into color. So now we're just filling in this shape right here, observing carefully and filling in a very simple and abstract shape. In general, we want to keep this area of the painting a little bit more quiet, a little bit more laid back. Now here we are with the cast shadow. So remember, the cast shadows are usually a little bit darker. That is the cast shadow on the model's shoulder being casted by the clothing that the model is wearing. So now here's a very easy to understand plane shift. So this plane is shifting into the light. You can very clearly tell that that area of the clothing is facing the light a little bit more, and even this area right here. So this area is facing the light even more, but not as much as the corner of the model's clothing. Now this area here is facing the light a lot more as well, creating a tad bit of contrast, but not that much contrast for the side of the model's clothing. And now we're just going to soften this little edge right here with the brush and create a little bit more of a little transition here just for fun for the side of the clothing. Not going to describe it that much, so just going to make it a little bit soft and hidden from the viewer. A very simple transition there. And let's paint just a little bit of light here on the shoulder. But that area is going to be left to vignette. So if you've seen my previous videos, you know that the vignette is the area of the painting that we leave unfinished to complement the areas that are more finished. And that's kind of an aesthetic thing because we don't want to take every part of the painting to the same degree of finish either. And now let's paint in some of the lights on the other side. So very carefully with a light touch, we made the bottom of the chin, the edge of the bottom of the chin, a little bit softer, but the corner of the white contrasting with the chin is an edge that is a little bit more sharp. And we're going to leave that sharp edge be just to bring focus to that area of the face. Now we're painting in the light right about here on the corner of the side of the clothing that the model's wearing. Now there's a little bit of a brighter tone right about here, and we're squiggling the brush a little bit just to create a softer edge. We don't want any of the information onto this area of the painting to distract from the rest of the painting. Now with just a little halftone right about here, we're going to soften this little transition just to give some more variety to the edges. And a little bit more of a dark tone right about here. And following through on the other side as well. And now with that watercolor brush, we're just going to soften a few of the edges, thus completing the underpainting. A few little soft touches here and there, just to ensure that we don't leave too many sharp edges where we don't want them. And just to finish the underpainting up, I'm actually going to extend this shape for the shoulder just a little bit, using the second to the lightest value, just a little extension of this shape. And now we're going to be ready to move on to color once this layer dries. I'd like to thank you so much for watching this painting video, and as always, stay tuned for the next segment. And in the next video, we're going to be developing the flesh tones as a result of the structure, the underlying structure that we found in this video.